The congregation had gathered as they always had, warm breath against frosted glass, hymnals open to familiar pages, minds half awake, spirits just barely tethered to the sanctuary. It was a service like many before it, predictable, practiced, even pleasant. But then came the moment that shattered it. The church is often seen as a refuge, a safe harbor from the storms of the world. We come to it expecting comfort, familiarity, and a sense of belonging. But what if, hidden beneath the hymns and the stained glass, something else was happening, something we rarely see but are always part of? The truth is, even within the walls of the sanctuary, spiritual battles are quietly being fought. The pews may seem calm, the altar still, but the air is not empty. There is always more taking place than our senses can detect. In the spiritual realm, the church is not merely a place of worship, it is a front line. What unfolded during the strange incident in the church was not just a disruption, it was a revelation. It peeled back the illusion of safety and reminded us that sacred spaces do not exempt us from spiritual conflict. In fact, they attract it. For where souls gather to draw near to God, forces opposed to Him also linger, waiting for distraction, division, or decay to take root. The visitor who appeared during the service was not just a man. He was a symbol of this deeper conflict, a disruption sent or allowed to expose what had long been hidden. His presence unsettled not because he did anything wrong, but because he reminded everyone of a truth they had forgotten. Holiness is not passive, and neither is evil. Many in the church that day were forced to confront their own spiritual condition. Some realized that they had grown spiritually sleepy, going through the motions. Others felt the weight of things they had buried, brought up to the surface not by words, but by something unspoken. The incident was strange, yes, but not random. It was a moment when the veil between the visible and the invisible grew thin. And in that moment, the church became what it was always meant to be, not a place of mere routine, but a battleground where hearts are tested, exposed, and, by grace, transformed. The moment he entered, everything shifted. It was not his clothes that marked him, simple, unremarkable garments like any man might wear. It was not his age or demeanor. He walked without noise, stood without drawing attention, and yet the atmosphere in the church changed the instant he appeared. No one recognized him, and yet everyone noticed him. There was an undeniable tension, like the sudden drop in temperature before a storm. He did not take a seat. He did not join in the singing. He stood at the back, perfectly still, his eyes scanning the congregation with a calmness that was almost unsettling. Though the others tried to carry on as usual, a quiet unease crept into the room like smoke under a door. There is something deeply disquieting about the presence of a stranger in a place where everyone assumes they know each other, where comfort comes from predictability and shared routine. The stranger disrupted that illusion. In a space where people had grown used to being unchallenged, his very presence became a question they didn't want to answer. Why is he here? Who sent him? And what does he see that we do not? People shifted in their seats. Some tried not to look. Others couldn't help but stare. The service that had started with ease now struggled to find its rhythm. The preacher's voice faltered. The worship team glanced nervously toward the back. Even the children grew unusually quiet, sensing something the adults could not explain. What made this visitor so strange was not that he acted out, but that he did not act at all. He didn't disrupt with words or movement. He disrupted by simply being there. His silence was louder than any shout. It was as if he was observing, searching, maybe even judging, but no one knew why, and that made it worse. The mind races in the absence of explanation. Was he sent by God? Was he a warning, a test, or something else altogether? Whatever he was, he did not belong in the comfortable script the church had written for itself. And yet, perhaps he belonged more than anyone else. Perhaps he came not to disturb, but to reveal. Sometimes it takes an outsider to show us just how closed off we've become. Sometimes it takes a presence we don't understand to force us to question everything we assumed was settled. The visitor wasn't just a man, he was a mirror, and what he reflected shook the room. What made the incident unforgettable was not merely the presence of the stranger, but the effect he had on the hearts of those inside the church. He did not speak a word, yet his silence seemed to echo louder than the sermon itself. It was as though his presence peeled away a veil, exposing not just the liturgy and the routine, but the inner lives of those participating in them. For years, the congregation had operated in a certain rhythm, polished, rehearsed, and familiar. People sang the hymns, bowed their heads, said their amens, and went home with the comfort of having done church. But that day, everything was different. That day, each person began to see themselves not through their own eyes, but through the eyes of something or someone greater, truer, and far less interested in appearances. It is one thing to act holy, it is another to be holy. The incident revealed the gap between the two. As the service went on, people began to feel a strange unease, not because of what was said, but because of what was left unsaid. The stranger stood like a silent witness, and somehow his very stillness seemed to search the room, uncovering pride in some, guilt in others, and a deep spiritual emptiness in many. One man, known for his long prayers, found himself unable to speak at all. A woman who had not cried in years suddenly wept. A young couple who rarely paid attention found themselves clinging to every word, as if something eternal were suddenly at stake. No one accused them. No one exposed them aloud. Yet everyone felt as though they had been seen, truly seen, for the first time in years. And that kind of seeing is both terrifying and holy. It strips away the mask. It reveals the hidden motives behind the smiles, the pride behind the good deeds, the fear behind the certainty. The visitor never spoke, but in his silence he became like a burning lamp in a dark cellar, illuminating things long forgotten, long ignored. By the end of the service, it was not the sermon that lingered in their minds. It was the discomfort of that inner exposure. It was the realization that faith had become more performance than relationship, that they had grown content with surface obedience while neglecting the soul. The incident forced everyone to look inward, to examine whether their worship came from the heart or merely from habit. And once you've seen yourself in that kind of mirror, you cannot look away. There is a quiet danger in the routines of religion, a slow, creeping numbness that settles over the soul when the sacred becomes ordinary. When worship turns into habit, when prayer becomes repetition, when sermons are evaluated like lectures instead of received as truth, something vital begins to fade. This is the danger that had taken root in the church long before the strange incident occurred. The people didn't notice it. Not at first. It is easy to miss when you're doing all the right things on the outside. The songs were sung in key, the liturgy followed without flaw, and the offering collected with precision. But beneath the surface, the fire was going out. They had grown used to God, used to His name, His word, even His presence. They had caged the eternal in routine and expected Him to stay quiet within the lines they had drawn. The strange visitor was not loud, yet he shattered that illusion. He brought with him an unease that no program could smooth over. Suddenly, the structure of the service felt flimsy, like a beautiful painting hanging over a crack in the wall. It was not what he did, but what he disrupted, the illusion that everything was fine. His presence revealed just how mechanical their faith had become. People realized they were mouthing truths they no longer wrestled with, offering prayers they no longer believed would be answered, and listening to messages they no longer expected to change them. The incident exposed how far they had drifted from the awe and fear of the living God. Habit in itself is not evil, but habit without heart is hollow. The church had fallen into a dangerous sleep, lulled by the comfort of repetition. And when you sleep too long in a place of battle, you leave yourself wide open. The incident was a wake-up call, a divine interruption. It was as if God, seeing the drift of his people, allowed a moment of holy disturbance to break through the fog of familiarity. And for the first time in a long while, the people had to confront the question, have we been coming to church, or have we been coming to power? That day, many realized the difference, and once they did, they could never return to sleep. The strange event had torn the curtain, exposing their hearts and the absence of fire within. At first glance, the incident seemed merely strange, perhaps even unfortunate, a moment of awkwardness, of interruption, of mystery. But as time passed, something deeper began to emerge, something that could not be easily explained away. The minds of the congregation kept returning to that silent figure, the way he had watched, the unease that had filled the air, and the sudden unraveling of what was once so predictable. For many, it took days to realize that what had happened was not just a disturbance, but a message, veiled, unsettling, yet unmistakably divine. God does not always speak through thunder. More often, he speaks through interruption. He breaks into the familiar not with violence, but with silence that demands to be noticed. That day in the church, the message came not through words, but through presence, an unsettling, searching presence that stirred long, still waters. It exposed hearts, yes, but more than that, it invited awakening. The disturbance was not a punishment. It was a call to return, a call to remember, a call to open the door to God, not as a tradition or a doctrine, but as a living person whose holiness cannot be contained in programs or pews. The divine message was not, you have failed. It was rather, you have forgotten, and now you are being reminded. Reminded of the fear of the Lord, which is the beginning of wisdom. Reminded of the sacredness of worship, the weight of grace, the reality of judgment, and the beauty of surrender. For some, it was a call to repent. For others, a call to kneel. For all, it was a moment to recognize that God was no longer standing politely at the edges, but had stepped directly into their midst. And perhaps that was the miracle, that God would still come, not in anger, but in mercy, not to destroy, but to awaken, that he would send, even through a stranger, a message the soul had long needed, but never dared to ask for.